Watch complete video to practice questions about Citizenship Test Australia. Responsibilities and privileges of Australian citizenship. What duty does an Australian citizen have towards the law of the country? You must obey the laws of Australia. What is an Australian citizen's duty when it comes to voting? A. To vote in federal, state, or territory elections. B. To vote in a referendum. If needed, who should defend Australia? All Australian citizens. Who can be called to serve on a jury anytime? Any Australian citizen. Does Australia give any privileges to the Australian citizens? Yes. What privilege does the Australian government give to the citizens in case of voting? They can vote in the federal and state or territory elections. They can vote in a referendum. Who can apply for children born overseas to become Australian citizens by descent? Australian citizens. As an Australian citizen, which jobs can you apply for? The Australian Public Service or the Australian Defence Force. What are some of the privileges that will be given to Australian citizens? A. Apply for work in the Australian Public Service and the Australian Defence Force. B. Apply for an Australian passport and re-enter Australia freely. C. Ask for consular assistance from an Australian official while overseas. Why are laws made? To maintain an orderly, free, and safe society to protect our rights. Who should obey the laws made in Australia? All Australian citizens and other people in Australia. Voting is an important responsibility, right, and privilege for all Australian citizens above which age? 18. What is the responsibility for Australian citizens aged 18 years or over regarding voting? They should vote in federal and state or territory elections. What is a referendum? A vote to change the Australian Constitution. By voting, what do Australian citizens have a say in? How Australia is governed and contribute to its future. In which elections is voting compulsory all over Australia? A. Territory elections. B. Federal and state elections. In which election is it not compulsory to vote in some states? Local government elections. Is service in the Australian Defence Force voluntary? Yes, it is voluntary. What responsibility do Australian citizens have if the need to defend Australia arises? Australian citizens should defend Australia should the need arise. What should all Australian citizens commit to do? Join together to defend the nation and its way of life if necessary. Who can serve in a jury if called upon? Australian citizens over 18 years old. What is a jury? A group of ordinary Australian men and women who listen to the evidence in a court case. What does a jury do? They listen to evidence in a court case. Who can serve on the jury? Australian citizens who are on the electoral roll. What does the jury service ensure? The court system is open and fair. What is the privilege Australian citizens have regarding the Australian Public Service? they can apply for a job in the Australian public service. Who can work for the Australian government? Australian citizens. Can any Australian citizen who is aged 18 years and over seek election to Parliament at the federal, state and territory level? No, dual citizens cannot. What should people who serve in the Australian Parliament feel? Honour. It is a big responsibility. What happens when you become an Australian citizen? You can live freely in Australia. Who can apply for an Australian passport? New Australian citizens can apply for an Australian passport. What happens when an Australian citizen travels overseas? They are free to return to Australia without the need for a visa. In which countries does Australia have an embassy, high commission, or consulate? In many countries. Who can you ask for help if you are overseas as an Australian citizen? An Australian government official. What are some examples of emergency cases in which Australian citizens might need help overseas? A. Natural disaster. B. Civil unrest. Under what cases can Australian officials help Australian citizens overseas? A. Serious illness and death. B. In case of an accident. C. Getting an emergency passport. Which country's laws should you obey being an Australian citizen? Laws of the country you are currently in. How can Australian citizens make sure their children born overseas are also Australian citizens? By applying for their children to become an Australian citizen by descent.